Okay, depending on, I think we'll get started here. Depending on where you are, good morning or good afternoon, everyone. This is the fiscal year 2023 Community Project Funding Grantee Cohorts Session 3 on Environmental Review Process and Considerations. I'm Patrick Roberts. I'm a consultant with Civics and recently had the honor of developing some work aids for the environmental review process directly with the CPF program analysts with HUD, some of the grant officers and specialists, and the environmental clearance officer for HUD, whom I will have him introduce himself here in just a moment. But first, would like to go through some of the logistics for this session and introduce you all to some specific resources. So as usual, participants are going to be muted during the webinar. The PowerPoint presentation will be available on the HUD Exchange. May take a bit, but it will be available, and that PowerPoint presentation will include the voiceover transcript of the presentation. You all should have received via email an advanced copy of the slides, as well as a resource that you can use. Also want to introduce you to the HUD Exchange website, the web address here. And then also on the HUD Exchange is an Ask a Question help desk for any type of question that you have on your CPF grant. And then want to highlight or introduce you, in case you have not been introduced to it yet, listserv, and encourage you all to sign up for listserv, which is also on the HUD Exchange. This is going to be used more in the future to communicate everything new that's going on with community project fundings, and we'll put out notifications of new resources that get uploaded, upcoming trainings, webinars, and other resources that should be helpful in implementing your CPF grants. So please, if you haven't, create an account on the HUD Exchange, sign up for listserv to get the most updated information that HUD is providing. For content-related questions during this presentation, we want to encourage you to use the Zoom chat feature. For this presentation, you're encouraged to submit your questions as we go through the presentation. So it's while you're thinking of them, and we'll try and get those answered as the presentation is progressing. And then at the end, we'll have another opportunity for some Q&A, and we'll follow up and answer anything that has not been answered by the end of the presentation. We'll get those answered at that time. So as I mentioned, we've got the environmental officer from HUD here with us today. I'm going to turn it over to Omri and have him introduce himself to you all.
All right, thanks, Patrick, and
Yes.
hi, everyone. My name is Omri Gross. I'm the Program and Environmental Clearance Officer for HUD's Community Planning and Development Programs, which includes the Community Project Funding Program. I work closely with the Office of Economic Development, the Office of Environment and Energy, and the Congressional Grants Division to help design and implement the environmental framework for this unique and nuanced program. This program, as I mentioned, is unique. It has some additional considerations that, and it kind of runs a little bit differently than our other HUD programs. So there are some other considerations with the environmental review process. And so I'm here to help answer any questions. If you have any questions related to environmental review and the Community Project Funding Program during this presentation, feel free to put them in the chat. I'll be here. I'll respond in the chat. And then if we have any additional questions that I haven't responded to at the end, I can come off mute and we can have a little back and forth to get those questions answered as well. But very happy to be here and looking forward to your questions and looking forward to Patrick's coverage of this very important topic. Thanks, Patrick.
All right, thank you, Omri. As I mentioned moments ago, I'm a consultant, Patrick Roberts, consultant with Civics. My background is I have some background in construction management as an administrative director, responsible for implementing new projects from project design, working with local municipalities on the permitting, uh, through funding and then through the completion of the project, as well as experience working as a state employee and working as a consultant to local governments in policy setting and disaster recovery program management, and then cross-cutting requirements, including environmental review. So being involved in the construction and disaster recovery projects of all types where federal funding is involved, you learn early that it's essential to have a foundational understanding of the environmental review process and the many different concepts, requirements, and regulations that weave throughout that review process. So today we're going to do a review of the environmental review process. And to some, this may be a refresher, and if so, that's great. Never hurts to have that refresher on environmental review. To others, this brief overview could be your introduction into the world of environmental review. The hope is that everyone will be able to say that they've learned something to improve their understanding of the environmental review process, and more importantly, how that environmental review process applies to the CPF projects and help you to move those projects forward. So the review is going to cover a wide range of topics, starting with the question of what is an environmental review, all the way through and to the end of this presentation, where we'll talk through some specific considerations for community project funding. So let's get started. So what is environmental review? An environmental review, it's an analysis of the impacts that that project or your project will have, that your project will have on the surrounding environment and how the environment will affect the project. So incidentally, step one of the environmental review is to develop a detailed project description. And hopefully you've all had the opportunity to attend the project narrative session that was, I think, a week ago, maybe 2 weeks ago. The work that you do on that project narrative can help you build into this project description for your environmental review. The completed review demonstrates that HUD funded projects have complied with all of the applicable laws and authorities and ensures that those projects provide decent, safe, and sanitary housing. An environmental review is required for all HUD assisted projects and is a public document used to encourage public participation. And while all HUD assisted projects require an environmental review, not all projects require the same level of effort to complete that review, which we'll take a look at here on the next slide. So this slide includes a rough breakdown of each level of review to illustrate which levels of review are more common and to highlight capacity and timing considerations. So you can see there are a few different levels of review. Projects require different levels of review based on the nature and the scope of the project activities. So starting here on the left side of the screen, there's exempt and the CENST level of review, which is short for categorically excluded, not subject to certain laws and authorities. These reviews are used more for like soft costs. Sorry, folks. Used for soft costs and operational costs. Most maintenance activities are included in the exempt in the CENST. There aren't many laws and authorities to address. They have very limited compliance requirements and can be done pretty quickly. We often see a lot more of these types of reviews because there are just a lot more activities within this type of scope of soft costs that we see coming through for this community project funding. Next is the CEST level of review, which is the categorically excluded but is subject to the laws and authorities of 58.5, which we'll talk about in the next coming slides. These can be refinances, minor rehabilitations, single family housing construction. The projects under this level of review are much smaller types of projects than the next level of review, which requires an environmental assessment. These are the larger multifamily construction projects, infrastructure projects, project types that go beyond just the minimal groundbreaking of the CEST. This level of review can take a little bit longer to review. They do require compliance with all of the federal environmental laws and authorities, including a NEPA analysis, which is the National Environmental Policy Act, which is known as the Environmental Assessment Factors Analysis. These could take longer to review, and we see fewer projects at this level of review. And then we have the highest level of review, which is the environmental impact statement. These are extremely rare. These are the larger scale infrastructure projects, projects with 2,500 plus housing units. Some of these can be disaster related projects, but really you're not going to see very many of your projects fall into this level of review, not under the community project funding program. A couple of things that I want you to note here is that the level of review is not dependent on the amount of funding involved in the project, but is dependent on the level of potential impact to the environment the project may have. And then the second thing I want you to take note of is the staffing and the timing considerations. You see here at the bottom of each of these different levels of review, it gives you an idea of the time that it takes, which is kind of an indication of the staff capacity that you'll need in terms of your local government capacity to conduct the environmental review for your CPF grant. This slide here gives us an indication or shows us the laws and authorities, and depending on your project's level of review, which we just discussed, a HUD environmental review may have to consider a wide range and variety of environmental laws and authorities. This can include the National Environmental Policy Act, could include Endangered Species Act, historic preservation, site contamination, floodplain management, noise abatement, and so on. You get an idea from the list here. Under NEPA and its implementing regulations, all federal agencies have a duty to assess the impacts of the major actions they propose to undertake and to consider reasonable alternatives to choose from to reduce or eliminate those impacts. These alternatives will be referred to later in this presentation as choices. This is kind of the universe of the environmental laws and authorities that your project may need to comply with. So let's get into the regulations that govern the review process that you will all need to have completed for your projects. Those regulations are 24 CFR Part 58 and 24 CFR Part 50. Environmental reviews for projects under Part 58 are completed by a unit of general local government, which the project is located in. So the unit of general local government serves as the responsible entity and conducts the environmental review for the project. For the CPF legislation, it allows for environmental reviews to be completed under Part 58 by a unit of general local government as the responsible entity, which is the default desired for the CPF program. So we should all be trying to encourage that unit of general local government in which the project is located to serve as the responsible entity and to conduct the environmental review whenever possible. There are times, though, where a nonprofit recipient cannot secure a local government responsible entity to conduct their review and may need to reach out to HUD to complete the review under Part 50. And we'll talk about Part 50 here in just a little bit. So Part 58, the grantee or the recipient provides all the necessary information to the local government entity acting as the responsible entity to complete the environmental review for the project. This may involve the hiring of an environmental consultant to collect, to gather, to compile all of the information that's needed and provide that to that responsible entity. This will really be a call between you as the grantee or the recipient and the local government as to whether or not they have the staff capacity to conduct the environmental review, or if they will need you to hire an environmental consultant to essentially do that legwork, to compile all of that information. Then the local government would independently review and verify that information. If a project rises to the CEST or that categorically excluded but subject to, or to the EA, which is the environmental assessment level of review, which we covered a couple of slides back. When we went through the different levels of review, the local government responsible entity will need to publish a public notice of the findings from the environmental review. They'll need to publish a notice of intent to request the release of funds and to allow for the appropriate public comment period to collect and address any comments received from the public. This publishing of the notice informs the public that this is the project that the local government is doing an environmental review for, and then is informing the public of any impacts that the project may have. So after the local government waits the appropriate comment period after publishing a public notice, that responsible entity, that local government, would submit a request for release of funds to HUD. HUD then waits a 15-day objection period. And then after that objection period, if there are none, HUD will issue an authority to use grant funds. The grantee then provides a copy of that authorization to use grant funds to their grant officer and copies the environmental officer. Then once that authorization to use grant funds has been received and shared with the grant officer and environmental officer, the grantee can then proceed with the project. But the grantee must also implement, as you see in that last box there, that they'll need to implement any mitigation if required. And we'll talk about a little bit more about mitigation in the coming slides, but I wanted to draw your attention to that concept of mitigation. So this is the process for an environmental review when the project is done under Part 58, which again is when the local government conducts the environmental review. There are a couple of differences between the environmental review process for Part 58 and Part 50, where that local government is conducting the review, and Part 50, where HUD conducts the review, which we'll talk about here in the next slide. So Part 50 is the regulation when HUD conducts the environmental review instead of the local government. So Part 58, local government conducts the environmental review. Part 50, HUD conducts the environmental review and provides all necessary requested project information to the HUD environmental officer. Again, still up to the grantee to provide all the information requested and necessary to complete the environmental review. But under Part 50, the environmental officer completes the review, conducts the consultations with any environmental authorities, and then they certify and approve that review. After that, the environmental officer will provide a copy of the environmental review record to the Congressional Grants Division grant officer, who will then provide a copy back to the grantee so that the grantee has a copy of the environmental review record. Once the environmental review has been approved and the grantee has a copy of that environmental review record that has been approved, the grantee can then proceed with the project. But again, they must implement and monitor any mitigation that's prescribed by the environmental review. So under Part 50, HUD conducting the review, HUD will inform the grantee if there are any mitigation measures that need to be implemented. So mitigation describes an effort that agencies must make to avoid or minimize the environmental impacts resulting from the project. So note here in the graphic that unlike Part 58, where the local government conducts a review and informs the public and then requests the release of funds and HUD issues an authorization to use grant funds, that process does not exist under Part 50, where HUD conducts the review, because essentially HUD is already certifying that the review has been reviewed and approved. So we don't need to go through those extra steps. So under Part 50, HUD conducts the review, HUD certifies the environmental review. While that may seem like it should take less time under Part 58, where HUD is conducting that environmental review, have to keep in mind that HUD's environmental staff capacity to take on large numbers of Part 58 or Part 50 reviews is limited. And so that's why we're encouraging that environmental reviews for the CPF projects to remain under Part 58, where the local government responsible entity can complete the review. Want to do a quick recap at this point. So the environmental review is conducted to determine if the project will have an impact on the environmental surroundings, as well as to determine if the environment will have any impacts on the project. 2, there are different levels of review depending on the type of project you have. 3, there are 2 different primary regulations that govern the environmental review process. That's Part 58 and Part 50. 4, environmental reviews must have a responsible entity. And 5, a satisfactory review process must be completed before the funds to cover the project costs can be released. Want to also introduce some terms going forward for you to be listening in for. 1 is legislative enactment, 2 is federal nexus, 3 is pre-nexus contract date, and 4 is choice limiting actions. So this next slide is date of legislative enactment. So this is an important date for your CPF project and the grant. This is the date that Congress appropriated the funds for that CPF project for that fiscal year. The reason it's important is because any costs that are incurred or activities that are performed prior to the date of legislative enactment are not eligible for repayment, and they do not need to be included in the environmental review for the project. So again, any costs that were incurred or activities performed prior to the date of legislative enactment for your fiscal year is not eligible for repayment and does not need to be included in the environmental review for the project. So for the cohort that we're on for today, that legislative enactment date is December 29, 2022. Next slide talks about that federal nexus and choice limiting actions. The federal nexus is the point at which the project becomes federalized and when the federal environmental review requirements are triggered. The federal nexus for fiscal year 23, again, December 29, 2022. Just wanting to call out that if you also attended the environmental review session for 2022, that federal nexus date information is also shared here, but you'll see that the federal nexus date was different than the enactment date. Not important right now, but just wanted to call out that if you have any questions, if you do have a 2022 and you have any questions on the difference of those dates, please do reach out to your grant officer. So the grantee's local government responsible entity and HUD will be required to complete a satisfactory environmental review covering all work that took place or is proposed to take place after that federal nexus date. And the environmental review needs to be completed prior to the requesting of repayment from HUD for those activities. A couple of slides back, I mentioned the concept of choice limiting actions, or it was actually reasonable alternatives. And I mentioned that reasonable alternatives we'd call them choices. And here we are. So under NEPA and its implementing regulations, all federal agencies have a duty to assess the impacts of the major actions they propose to undertake and to consider reasonable alternatives to choose from to reduce or eliminate those impacts. After the federal nexus, grantees are prohibited from taking new choice limiting actions related to hard costs, including commitment or expenditure of HUD or non-HUD funds until a satisfactory review has been completed for the project. So if the environmental review has not been completed, then that analysis of reasonable alternatives to choose from has not been completed either. And by taking an action that essentially binds the project to a narrowed course or cutting yourself off from other possibilities or of alternatives, if you do that prior to completing the environmental review, then that's considered a choice limiting action. A choice limiting action is any activity that the grantee undertakes, including committing or expending HUD or non-HUD funds that reduces or eliminates a grantee's opportunity to choose project alternatives that would avoid or minimize environmental impacts. That is a choice limiting action. Now, there is one nuance to that that is an important one that we'll cover in just a moment. But this prohibition on choice limiting actions is true for all soft and hard cost activities and actions unless those actions are part of a pre-federal nexus contract or a pre-federal nexus contractual obligation, which we will talk about more in a moment. But essentially, this prohibition on taking choice limiting actions is in effect for all soft and hard costs and activities and actions that are carried out after the federal nexus date. So this slide here also shows some of the examples of choice limiting actions: entering contracts, commitments, acquisitions, leasing, rehab, demolition, new construction, ground disturbance, such as clearing, grading, and grubbing. So this example of acquisition, if you're acquiring land or a site, you're committing funds to that site, you're committing the project for that site. And if you do that prior to completing the environmental review, you're cutting off all other opportunities or any alternative site that may have may be a better site environmentally. So if you do that, that's why it's considered a choice limiting action, because you're limiting the choice of alternatives. So I had mentioned that after the federal nexus, grantees are prohibited from taking new choice limiting actions, but there was that nuance. So it's except for activities that are part of a pre-nexus contractual obligation. So grantees are prohibited from taking new choice limiting actions until a satisfactory environmental review has been completed for the project, except for activities that are part of a pre-nexus contractual obligation. So although activities that were committed to under a pre-nexus contract are technically allowed, physical actions taken after the nexus may prevent a satisfactory environmental review. It may prevent the drawdown of grant funds. All activities performed after the federal nexus date are subject to the satisfactory environmental review in order for the project to be eligible for repayment. So that was allowed. So going to try and recap that again. Activities committed after the federal nexus date, but associated with a pre-nexus contract are: 1, technically allowed; 2, will not be considered choice limiting actions. So those are actions taken prior to. They will not be considered choice limiting actions. 3, still need to be cleared as part of the environmental review. 4 are activities taken at the grantee's own risk. And we'll talk again about pre-nexus contracts later in the presentation, as it also relates to cost eligibility. So HUD's aggregation requirement under 24 CFR Part 58 states that the environmental review must group together and evaluate as a single project all individual activities performed after the federal nexus date, which are related either on a geographic or functional basis, or are logical parts of a composite of contemplated actions. This includes activities associated with pre-nexus contractual obligations that were performed after the federal nexus, but does not include related activities performed prior to the federal nexus or soft costs covered by HUD's Part 58 nationwide environmental review for CPF soft costs or soft costs for which a separate exempt or CENST determination has been made under Part 58. The mentioning of soft costs, going to talk some more about soft costs. So most soft costs, but not all, are covered by HUD's Part 50 nationwide review for CPF soft costs. HUD conducted a nationwide programmatic environmental review for the entire CPF program that covers, again, most, but not all, soft costs. And you can find links to each review here on this slide, as well as on the CPF landing pages. And you can see a list of which soft costs on that landing page. You can see a list of which are covered in the project description of that environmental review record. So you can click on the link, pull up the nationwide environmental review record that HUD conducted for soft costs, and you can see project description. It lists out all the types of soft costs that are covered. In general, it includes planning, administrative, operating costs, maintenance costs that comply with HUD's Notice 16-02, which you can see a link here, is the guidance for categorizing an activity as maintenance for compliance with HUD's environmental review. So maintenance costs that comply with that notice are covered by HUD's Part 50 review for soft costs. And with the recent legislative changes that were enacted for both fiscal years last December, there is no longer a cap on how much of your CPF grant can go towards soft costs. However, if you intend to repurpose your grant to 100% of your soft costs, you must get approval from your grant officer to see if that's appropriate and potentially a path forward. So again, saying that most but not all soft costs are covered by HUD's Part 58 nationwide review, and they can be incurred anytime after the date of legislative enactment for your fiscal year grant. So there's another important reason to know the date of your legislative enactment or federal nexus. I had mentioned a couple of times here that most, but not all, of the soft costs are covered by that nationwide. There are some soft costs that are obviously then not covered. And if you have those soft costs in your project that are not covered by HUD's Part 50 review, then you'll need to complete a separate exempt CENST determination, an environmental review determination by the responsible entity or HUD prior to incurring those costs before you can start incurring those non-covered soft costs. It's essentially just a determination that those soft costs are either exempt or CENST, or that not subject to. There is some compliance and authorities, but there are just 3 laws and authorities for that level of review, and it should be a very quick environmental review process, which we'll talk about more of the soft costs that are not covered on the next slide. So this slide gives us, on the left side, it gives some of the covered soft costs, and then on the right side, some that are not. A nice breakdown. It provides also the corresponding regulatory citation next to each of those covered and non-covered. So the covered soft costs include the environmental and other studies, resource identification, development of plans, public service inspections, jumping down there, supportive services, operating costs, including most maintenance, which we'll talk about more on the next slide. And what we mean here when purchasing a vehicle, but not purchasing other equipment. So we'll talk more on the next slide about the maintenance costs. So those are the soft costs that are covered by HUD's Part 58 nationwide environmental review. Those that are not covered, those are the ones that are going to require that separate environmental review determination, which again should be able to be done pretty quickly. It can be done separate from the larger environmental review considerations for the whole project, but it still needs to be put in place by the responsible entity. So soft costs that are not covered by HUD's Part 50 nationwide environmental review are costs such as purchasing of tools, emergency assistance necessary to control or arrest the effect from disasters or imminent threats to public safety, tenant-based rental assistance, economic development activities, affordable housing, pre-development costs, and the approval of supplemental assistance. Now, the reason some of these soft costs are not covered by HUD's nationwide review is because there is a chance they may require compliance with one or more laws or authorities, which will depend on the nature, the extent, or location of that activity. But HUD could not account for those things in the nationwide review, so that's why they could not be included as part of that nationwide Part 50. It would be difficult for HUD to know where all the projects would be located and to know what the environmental conditions of the projects would be. HUD could only do this kind of broad level nationwide environmental review record to cover certain soft costs, because some of these other soft costs may require, again, that additional compliance with uh, an example would be compliance with flood insurance requirements. So again, HUD completed the nationwide environmental review for all the soft costs that HUD could clear at that nationwide level, but had to leave out some of the soft costs that may require compliance with one or two laws and authorities that HUD was not able to ensure compliance with at the nationwide level. If you have any questions about whether a soft costs are covered or not, or if they would require their own environmental review, please reach out and discuss with your environmental officer, and at the end of this, we'll provide a slide that has a link on it that has contact information if you are in need of learning who your environmental officer is. This next slide shows the table from HUD's notice on categorizing activities as maintenance for the purpose of environmental review. So if you recall from the last slide, under the soft costs, it includes operating costs, including most maintenance activities. So this is how you can determine whether an activity is maintenance and whether or not that maintenance activity is actually covered by the Part 50 nationwide review for soft costs. As you can see in the table, it shows different types of activities and whether or not they are considered maintenance or rehab for the environmental purposes. So all the activities listed under rehab, which is the column on the very right, those are not covered by HUD's nationwide review and would need to be included in a satisfactory environmental review for the project prior to the work being performed. All activities listed under maintenance, which is the middle column, except for the one with an asterisk near them at the very bottom, excuse me, those are covered by HUD's Part 50 environmental review for soft costs. And these activities can be incurred anytime after the date of enactment for your fiscal year grant and would not need to be covered by a separate project-specific environmental review prior to incurring those costs. But drawing attention to the activities marked by an asterisk there at the bottom, it's the installation or replacement of carpeting or vinyl flooring. Those activities are marked by an asterisk. Those are not covered by HUD's Part 50 nationwide review for soft costs because they may require the purchase of flood insurance if they happen to occur in a special flood hazard area, and if the costs exceeded the standard deductible for the specific type of structure or unit under the National Flood Insurance Program. So long story short, because those activities have that asterisk, they may require further review to determine whether they will require flood insurance. They will then need to be covered by that separate environmental review, again, conducted by the responsible entity for the project to consider that specific location and circumstance. Okay, so let's talk about hard costs and how to handle work that was already under contract. So this was something that I had mentioned a little bit earlier. So if you have a pre-nexus contractual obligation, how do you handle that? So you may recall that following the federal nexus, no party may enter into additional construction contracts or take new or other choice limiting commitments or actions that include spending funds or performing physical work. So you're restricted from doing that until the environmental review process is complete and all necessary approvals are received. So, one more time, following the federal nexus, no party may enter into additional construction contracts or take other new choice limiting actions until the environmental review process is complete and all necessary approvals are received. With one caveat, that's regarding work under an existing pre nexus contractual obligation. So grantees are technically allowed to undertake physical work under those contractual obligations that were entered into prior to the federal nexus and can incur those activity costs that are or were performed anytime after the federal nexus as hard costs, and they could potentially be eligible for repayment. The reason for this is because if you, as the grantee, had already entered into a contractual obligation prior to the project becoming federalized or prior to that federal nexus date, HUD really can't tell you outright that you can't move forward with that project. You have a contractual obligation to move forward with those activities. Now, HUD will always encourage, as a best practice, of stopping all work after that federal nexus, if at all possible. And this is because even though you are allowed to move forward and perform activities after the federal nexus that are associated with a pre nexus contractual obligation, grantees would be doing so at their own risk. The reason behind that is because all work that has or will take place after the federal nexus, regardless of your pre nexus contractual obligation status, all of that work that has or will take place after the federal nexus must be covered by a satisfactory environmental review for the project to be eligible for repayment. You can find some additional insights on this guidance from HUD to CPF grantees on page 2 and page 3 of the fiscal year 23 Community Project Funding Environmental Guidance and Scenarios. That's a good resource to turn to for some additional information on this. So, what do we mean by satisfactory environmental review here? A satisfactory environmental review must include an analysis of the applicable environmental laws and authorities, must include a determination that the project activities will not will not result in environmental harm that cannot be mitigated. It has to include must complete all consultation with federal and state agencies in a manner that allows for mitigation measures and conditions to be implemented. And it includes a request for release of funds and a certification for the project that has been approved by the HUD CPD Field Office Director as required. So the satisfactory environmental review must cover all related project activities performed after the federal nexus, except for those hard costs that are covered by HUD's Part 50 nationwide review for CPF soft costs, restating that HUD has already completed that satisfactory review for those covered soft costs, but a satisfactory environmental review must cover all related project activities performed after the federal nexus date of December 29, 2022. And a satisfactory environmental review must show that the project will not result in any unmitigated environmental harm, and a satisfactory environmental review must also show that the project was able to complete all necessary consultations with environmental review authorities for any work already performed. So for projects that have a pre-nexus contractual obligation, this can be a problem for them, because as the work is technically allowed to proceed prior to the completion of the environmental review, any work that you have under a pre-nexus contractual obligation will still need to be covered by a satisfactory environmental review for the project to be eligible for repayment. Some of these situations will require an after the fact or midstream consultation with environmental authorities for activities that have already been performed. This is not typically how consultations are done for environmental reviews, and it's not usually how we do consultations with environmental authorities. We usually do those consultations and the environmental review prior to those activities being carried out. But some of these situations, again, will require the after the fact or midstream consultations with those authorities for activities that have been performed. Some of those environmental authorities are much less likely to agree to these midstream or post-activity consultations. One example is the State Historic Preservation Office and the Fish and Wildlife Services for Endangered Species. Some laws and authorities, such as when dealing with floodplains and floodways on a site, could also require compliance and decision-making processes that may not be achievable after the work has already occurred. We are seeing, particularly with state historic preservation offices, that they are refusing to consult on projects that already have performed physical work, such as demolition or rehab on properties listed in the National Register of Historic Places. So they believe that, by doing that work prior to that consultation, the adverse effect on that historic property it's unavoidable. It's already been done, and so that's why that they're refusing to do that. So the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation has provided some guidance on this that states that applicants and federal agencies should avoid any commitments or activities that harm historic properties prior to completing the Section 106 historic review process, which is part of the HUD environmental review process. There is ongoing internal coordination happening with the Federal Preservation Office, along with the OMRI and the National Conference of State Historic Preservation Offices, to try and coordinate on some solutions and paths forward to some of these issues, but it's still a very real consideration that projects should be aware of. So again, technically, we're talking about pre-nexus contractual obligations. If you entered into a contract prior to that federal nexus for work to be performed after the federal nexus, the best practice is to stop all work until the environmental review is complete. But again, how HUD cannot mandate you to stop if you already have that obligation, that pre-nexus obligation, contractually obligating you to carry out that work. But if you can stop, HUD considers that to be the best practice. This next slide shows the CPF process flow for fiscal year 23, which many of you may already be familiar with. This particular graphic can be found in the CPF guidance and scenarios document, also on the HUD Exchange. It offers a visual breakdown of when both soft and hard costs are allowed to be incurred and when grantees can request payment for those activities in relation to the environmental review and grant agreement execution process. So the key takeaway here for fiscal 23, grantees are allowed to incur soft costs from the date of enactment, December 29, 2022. But those soft costs must be covered by HUD's Part 50 nationwide environmental review. If you have soft costs that are covered under that nationwide, then they can be incurred anytime after that federal nexus date. If you don't, if you have soft costs that are not covered, then you need to complete that prior to incurring those costs. HUD does encourage all physical work to stop after the federal nexus until the environmental review is completed. Grantees technically are allowed to incur ongoing hard costs at their own risk after that federal nexus date, but only for activities that were already a part of a pre-nexus contract. And ongoing here means you had that pre-nexus contractual obligation and you have these ongoing hard costs that you're obligated to perform. And I want to just articulate one more time that allowable nuance that having a pre-nexus contract makes. If you incurred costs after the pre-nexus date and they weren't part of a pre-nexus contractual obligation and you're moving forward with hard cost work, that would be considered a choice limiting action. But because you have that pre-nexus contractual, that contract in place, that has then a contractual obligation to perform that work, it is technically not considered a choice limiting action violation. This next slide is a logic tree chart that we put together to assist grantees and grant officers in quickly and easily determining which project costs are eligible for repayment. The logic tree provides an illustration of what we just covered in the previous slide. These can also be found in your CPF environmental review guidance and scenario documents. And there's also a link to them on the CPF landing page on the HUD Exchange. There are two separate charts in that document, one for fiscal year 2022 cohorts and one for 2023 respectively. There are also a couple of important caveats that apply to both charts. First, this chart assumes that eligible costs for activities covered by the project scope of a satisfactory environmental review, meaning that anytime you're using this chart and reach a determination that costs are eligible for repayment, the corresponding activity must be included in a satisfactory environmental review for the project to be eligible for repayment. If some costs or activities are not covered by the project's environmental review or by HUD Part 58, then those activities are not eligible for repayment. Secondly, costs that are considered incurred are considered at the point services are performed, not when the contract is signed or when the customer is billed. This chart also provides a link to HUD's nationwide Part 50 environmental review for those CPF soft costs, which again lists soft costs that are covered. And I think it's just worth repeating, costs are considered incurred at the point the service is performed, not when the contract is signed or when the customer is billed. This slide includes a list of some of the questions that might be helpful to ask early on in order to get an idea of your own situation as it relates to repayment eligibility and environmental review considerations. For example, any hard costs or activities performed completed prior to the date of enactment or federal nexus date. If you do have that, then they are not eligible for repayment and are not included in the scope of the environmental review. Do you have any soft costs activities performed prior to the date of legislative enactment? Those also are not eligible for repayment. Do you have any pre-nexus contractual obligations that involve hard cost activities to be performed after the federal nexus date? Best practice is to stop all physical work, but grantees can proceed at their own risk with performing activities that are part of a pre-nexus contractual obligation. Any contracts or commitments entered into or choice limiting actions taken following the federal nexus, not including activities associated with the pre-nexus contract. If so, that would constitute a choice limiting action violation and you should refer to your regional environmental officer for next steps. Last slide in your slide deck has resources and links that you should be able to click directly onto those links and be taken directly to that resource. CPF ER guidance and scenarios, mentioned that several times throughout the presentation. Guidance for documenting the environmental review record for CPF grants, the cost eligibility chart, which we just looked at, CPF review, environmental review training series. Those are not live trainings. Those are recorded trainings that can help you learn more about the environmental review process. You've got the soft costs nationwide fiscal year 22 and 23 links, and then some additional environmental review resources here on the right side, and just general environmental review resources on the very right side bottom there. Concluding there and opening it up, turning it over to Omri for questions, discussions at this point.
All right, thanks, Patrick. Wonderful
Yes.
job. And I think I addressed all of the questions that were submitted into the chat. I apologize if I missed yours. If I did not provide a response, or if you want to discuss it a little bit further, or if you have any additional questions, please feel free to come off mute or throw it in the chat, and I can read those questions out as well. But yeah, if you want to discuss any of the answers or have any other questions, follow-up questions, feel free to come off mute and we can talk through those.
Hi, this is Katie Hornbeck. I had a question. So I had put in the chat about what the process is if our budget is all soft costs, and I saw your response and appreciated the slide. I was just curious, what is the next step then for checking the environmental review box? In the project narrative I'm getting ready to submit, there's a section where we address it. Is that sufficient, or is there some form we have to fill out, or what's the next step?
So if your project is truly 100% activities that are covered by, and you saw that slide, right, that are covered by HUD's nationwide environmental review for CPF soft costs. If all of your activities are covered by that environmental review, then all you need to do is touch base with your grant officer, let them know that all of your activities fall under the nationwide environmental review for CPF soft costs. And then essentially that's it, right? That they will mark it down on their end, essentially, that you have complied with your environmental requirements because all of your activities are covered by HUD's environmental review, nationwide environmental review for CPF soft costs. So really, it's just a matter of touching base with your grant officer, letting them know that, and then they will check a box on their end. They'll update, a bunch of our spreadsheets on the back end to indicate that you've complied with your environmental review requirements. And this is in contrast to if you did, if your project did require an additional environmental review, like if all of your activities weren't covered by HUD's nationwide environmental review for CPF soft costs, then once you completed your environmental review, you would submit essentially, your environmental review signature page if it was a lower level of review, which again, you don't actually submit the actual environmental review to HUD or to your grant officer. For exempt and CENST level of reviews, you would just submit a copy of the environmental review signature page that's at the end of your environmental review, which is essentially telling your grant officer that, hey, here is the signature page. I can attest that we have complied with our environmental review requirements. Now, if your project rises to a higher level of review, like if you have significant groundbreaking, new construction, et cetera, right, activities that require a higher level of review, then it will likely require a public notice process, which again, you would work through with your responsible entity, your local government responsible entity. And then as part of that public notice process, after that public notice was issued and you get any comments, then you would issue your request for your release of funds to the HUD Community Planning and Development point of contact, which there are links for in the resources slide. And then HUD would issue you an authorization to use grant funds. And then you would provide that authorization to use grant funds to your grant officer to essentially, again, indicate that you have complied with your environmental review requirements. So so there's basically three options, right? If all of your activities are covered by HUD's nationwide environmental review for CPF soft costs, then all you have to do is touch base with your grant officer, let them know that all your activities are covered under HUD's nationwide environmental review for CPF soft costs, and then they will check that box saying that you've complied with your environmental review requirements. If your project has other exempt or lower level activities that require a lower level of environmental review, but you still need to conduct a separate environmental review because there are activities that are not covered by HUD's nationwide environmental review for CPF soft costs, then you will just need to provide a you will just need to provide a copy of the environmental review signature page to indicate that you've complied with your environmental review requirements. And then if it rises to the higher level of review, new construction, significant groundbreaking, et cetera, then you would need to provide a copy of the authorization to use grant funds to your grant manager, to indicate that you've complied with your environmental review requirements. That answer your question?
Yes, thank you so much.
You're very welcome. Any other questions? All right, and I know that Patrick, I know that you're planning on putting these out, sending out a written version or recap of the questions that were submitted into the chat. So if you're a grantee or in the audience and you didn't catch all of the questions and all the answers, I believe, Patrick, and you can discuss this a little bit.
Yes.
I believe you'll be sending something out in written form, right?
Yes, and actually we're working on pulling together a Q&A that has resulted from each of the session 3 environmental review sessions that we've provided, so that we can provide questions that have come in across all of the sessions to hopefully answer questions that maybe you hadn't thought of asking.
Even better.
In a specific session. So yes, working
And
on
we
getting...
do have an FAQ resource as well on that resources slide, a link to an FAQ resource that has some really common environmental review questions that we've received in the past as well. So there's plenty of resources there that kind of list out some of these common questions and answers. All right, I'm not seeing any other questions coming into the chat. Again, feel free to throw them in the chat or come off mute if you do have any questions. And if not, I'll turn it back over to you, Patrick.
Okay. Very good. So with no other questions, then we'll conclude this session of the environmental review presentation. Again, be looking, if you hadn't seen an email come in, be looking for an email that had a copy of the slide deck for you to step through the slide deck. That then that final slide has those links in it to those additional resources, maybe help jog some provide some connection to this presentation as well. And then we'll be working to get the recording up onto the website as well. Not sure what the timing is, but you should, as a participant, receive notification when it does get uploaded to the HUD Exchange. So be watching out for those things or that notification as well. And I want to thank Omri for participating, answering questions along the way, answering the question here at the end, and thank all of you for participating as well, and wish you all a great day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.